The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and brown sugar, but Margaret Thompson barely tasted the air. Her hands rested on the counter, palms pressed flat as though she needed the wood beneath them to keep her standing. The pie had come out of the oven flawless, golden crust, sugared top, steam curling like a ribbon into the quiet house. But the phone in her other hand had just carved a wound so deep she wasn't sure how to breathe through it. The voice message was only 12 seconds long. Just 12 seconds, and it had split her life cleanly in two. I can't keep pretending. She's useless. The old hag needs to hurry up and take her final nap so we can finally live a little. Paris is waiting. Her son's voice. David. The words had not been meant for her, but they lived in her ear now, jagged and sharp. He hadn't stumbled or laughed it off like a cruel joke. His tone was weary, matter-of-fact, the voice of a man confiding in someone he trusted. Margaret pressed replay once, then again. Each time her body betrayed her with the same cold rush, as though every vein had turned to ice water. She wanted desperately to believe she'd misheard, but there it was, her only son, the boy she had carried, kissed, and defended his whole life, casually anticipating her death. She set the phone on the counter as though it were poisonous. Across from her, the pie cooled, untouched. A minute ago it had been her gesture of love for his visit tomorrow. Now it looked absurd, like a relic from a life she no longer occupied. For a long moment, Margaret just stood there, staring at her own reflection in the kitchen window. A 64-year-old widow, hair grayer at the temples, apron dusted with flour, lips trembling but eyes narrowing. She thought of Robert, her late husband, and the promise she'd made at his bedside when the cancer had taken him. Protect yourself, Maggie. People change when money's in the room. Even family. Back then, she had promised mostly to soothe him, never believing their son could be capable of what Robert had feared. But now she could hear Robert in her head as if he were still in the room, steady, cautious, already 3 steps ahead. Margaret's hand closed over the phone again. She no longer felt faint. She felt steady. Cold, but steady. Her voice when it came was barely a whisper, yet it filled the room. All right, Robert. It looks like the plan is no longer theory. She scrolled to a number she had memorized years ago but never dialed. Her thumb hovered for a beat, then pressed. The line connected after the second ring. Margaret? A familiar male voice, steady and low, carried through the receiver. Jim, she said, her voice even though her body still vibrated with shock. It's time. There was no confusion on the other end, no need for her to explain. A pause, the sound of papers being shifted, and then his calm reply, understood. I'll begin the calls tonight. When the line went dead, Margaret let the silence fill the kitchen once more. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked on the wall, and the cooling pie filled the air with sweetness so thick it turned bitter. She removed her apron and folded it neatly, as though performing an old ritual. Her hands were steady, but her mind churned. It had been Robert who first insisted on safeguards. He was lying in the hospital bed, pale and thin, when he'd spoken the words that now throbbed in her ears. Maggie, grief makes people strange. Money makes them strangers. She had shushed him, kissed his fingers, told him their children loved them. But Robert had not wavered. He had leaned close, his voice rasping, and outlined a series of steps, legal provisions, trusts, accounts, that would activate if she ever sensed betrayal. Promise me you'll use it if you need it. Don't doubt. Don't hesitate. Protect yourself. She had promised, thinking it a hollow safeguard against paranoia. Tonight, the promise felt like a lifeline. Margaret walked into the living room where Robert's recliner still sat untouched, his reading glasses resting on the side table. She lowered herself into the chair and closed her eyes. She saw David at 10 years old, running down the driveway with scraped knees, crying until she kissed the sting away. She saw Sarah, at 16, rolling her eyes during dinner, then sneaking into Margaret's bed after a nightmare, whispering that she'd always need her mother. These were her children, the ones Robert feared, the ones she'd refused to see clearly until now. Her phone buzzed in her lap, jolting her back. A text from Claire. Looking forward to tomorrow. David can't wait for your pie. The words were innocuous, the kind of message she might once have found sweet. But now, under the weight of the voice message, they read like a taunt. She stared at the screen until her reflection looked back at her, eyes hardened. Tomorrow was coming. They would arrive at her door with smiles, with flowers, with practiced voices of concern. And Margaret would be waiting, this time not as the soft, gullible mother they believed her to be, but as the widow who had promised her husband she would be ready. Morning arrived sharp and bright, a sky too cheerful for the weight Margaret carried. She set 2 coffee mugs on the counter, her motions deliberate. Everything looked ordinary, the clean kitchen, the vase of roses Robert had once planted outside now clipped for the table, but inside she braced herself like a soldier dressing for battle. At precisely 9 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. She opened it to find David and Claire standing side by side, polished and composed. David's smile was wide, rehearsed, his arms open. Claire held a bouquet of daisies wrapped in plastic, her lips painted a shade too bright. "Mom," David said warmly, leaning in for a hug. His cologne was heavy, a little desperate. Claire added, "These are for you." David said, "You love daisies." Margaret had been allergic to daisies for 20 years. She took them anyway, her face unreadable. "Come in." The 3 of them settled in the living room. Margaret poured coffee, her hand steady though her pulse hammered in her throat. She let them talk first. Claire's eyes roamed across the china cabinet. "Your home is so lovely, Margaret. So full of history." David's gaze lingered on the family photos. "You must feel overwhelmed, though. Keeping up with everything. It's a lot for one person." Margaret set down the sugar spoon and looked at her son. "What responsibilities do you think are too much for me?" David cleared his throat. "Well, the yard work, maintenance, grocery runs. And, you know, your health. At your age, I'm 64, David, not 94. Her voice was calm, but it sliced through the room. Claire leaned forward, palms folded, her sympathy painted on. "Of course, you're still young. But wouldn't it be nice to have help? To live somewhere safe, where everything is cared for?" From her purse, she drew out a glossy brochure. Elmwood Estates, resort-style living for active seniors. A golf course, fine dining, transportation, all neatly displayed in cheerful photographs. Margaret took it without looking down. Her lips curved into something that might have been mistaken for a smile. "And how much does this safe little paradise cost?" Claire's eyes lit up. "It's all covered when you sell this house. The equity would support you for years. And, of course, whatever remains when the time comes," David cut in smoothly. "It would come to us, just as your will always intended." Margaret let the silence stretch. Then she said softly, "Actually, the will has changed." The room chilled. Claire's hand froze on her mug. David's smile flickered. Margaret reached into the desk drawer beside her chair and placed a sealed envelope on the coffee table. "Would you like to hear what your father and I arranged?" The envelope sat on the table like a live wire. Neither David nor Claire reached for it. Their eyes darted between each other, then back to Margaret, who cradled her coffee cup with unnerving calm. "Changed?" Claire's voice cracked just slightly. What do you mean changed? I mean, Margaret said evenly, that your father anticipated this very moment. He knew grief can sour the heart. He made me promise to protect myself. David tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. Mom, you're upset. You shouldn't make decisions when you're emotional. We can talk through this as a family. Emotional? Margaret tilted her head, her eyes fixed on him. No, David. I've never been more clear. She reached for her phone on the table, tapped once, and pressed play. David's voice filled the living room, thick with irritation. I can't keep pretending. She's useless. The old hag needs to hurry up and take her final nap so we can finally live a little. Paris is waiting. The room froze. Claire's gasp was sharp and thin. David's face drained of color. Mom, wait, he started, leaning forward. Margaret cut him off, her voice steady but trembling at the edges. Explain to me, David. Explain how my death became a vacation plan. Claire's hands fluttered uselessly in the air. It's out of context. He didn't mean, out of context? Margaret's laugh was hollow. Do you think I don't know his voice? Do you think I imagined the part about Paris? David's jaw clenched. His eyes glistened, but whether with anger or shame, Margaret couldn't tell. I was frustrated. Talking to Claire about how hard it is to see you alone, refusing help. It came out wrong. Margaret leaned forward, her own hand steady on the table. Wrong, David, is forgetting a birthday. Wrong is leaving the stove on. This was not wrong. This was truth. Your truth, when you thought I couldn't hear you. Silence filled the room except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Claire stared at her mug as if she could crawl inside it. Margaret let the moment stretch, then tapped the envelope with one finger. Robert prepared for this. You see, if either of my children ever attempted to coerce or deceive me, everything we own goes to charity. Every penny. Your inheritance is not a right. It is a gift. One you both forfeited. The words landed heavy. David sat back hard, his face gray. Claire finally spoke, her voice brittle. You can't mean that. Margaret looked at them both, her voice quiet but unyielding. I've never meant anything more. The grandfather clock struck once, a hollow echo in the charged silence. David's hand twitched toward the envelope but stopped halfway, as if the paper itself might burn him. You wouldn't, he said finally, voice low, almost pleading. You wouldn't cut your own children out like this. Margaret's gaze stayed fixed on him. You already cut yourself out. I'm just making it official. Claire stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. This is insane. Margaret, you've misunderstood everything. We love you. We only want what's best for me. Margaret's voice cracked then, sharp as glass. Or what's best for your bank accounts? Don't lie to me. Not now. The front door opened before anyone could speak. Sarah's voice floated in from the hallway. Mom? I saw David's car. What's going on? Margaret's chest tightened. Sarah stepped into the living room, her husband Tom at her side, carrying a casserole dish swaddled in foil like some peace offering. But her eyes took in the scene, the envelope, David's gray face, Claire's rigid posture, and sharpened instantly. Mom, she said slowly, what's happening here? David sprang to his feet. She's threatening to give everything away. To strangers. Because of some stupid message, Margaret's voice cut through him. Not some message. Your words, David. Your contempt. Sarah looked at her brother, confusion flickering, then suspicion. What words? Margaret pressed play again. The recording spilled into the room a second time. The venom in David's tone was undeniable. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Tom muttered under his breath, "Jesus, David." David turned on his sister. "Don't you dare judge me. You've been saying the same things, just in prettier words. We all know what we've talked about: assisted living, finances, Mom's future. Don't act innocent now." Sarah's face went pale, but her silence betrayed her. Margaret rose from her chair, her body trembling but her voice iron. "Do you hear yourselves? My life reduced to numbers on a ledger, to brochures and bank accounts. I am not a problem. I am not a burden. And I will not be your retirement plan." Her children stood before her, exposed, scrambling, faces flushed with panic and shame. Once they had been toddlers in her arms. Now they were strangers, circling her like creditors. Margaret lifted the envelope and pressed it to her chest. "This ends tonight. You will leave my house. You will take your flowers, your casseroles, your brochures, and you will go." Tears blurred her vision, but her spine stayed straight. "Whatever family we once were, you buried it yourselves. My future belongs to me." For the first time, none of them argued. The silence was her victory. The house was still long after they left. No slammed doors, no shouted farewells, just the hollow sound of tires crunching down the driveway, growing fainter until silence reclaimed every corner. Margaret stood in her living room, her body trembling with the aftermath of holding firm. The daisies lay abandoned on the floor where Claire had dropped them, their pollen already setting her nose itching. She picked them up, carried them through the kitchen, and dropped them into the bin without ceremony. The pie was still there on the counter, its crust golden, the air around it faintly sweet. Once it had been baked for David, with love measured into each fold of dough. Now it felt like a monument to a falsehood she had finally stopped feeding. She cut a slice, placed it on a plate, and sat alone at the table. The first bite was sharp, buttery, almost bitter. But she kept chewing. It was hers now. Not his. Not theirs. Hers. Later, she pulled out a notebook she hadn't touched in years, the one she'd once used to jot down dreams for after Robert retired. Ireland. Scotland. Cooking school in Florence. Learn to paint roses. She flipped through the list slowly, fingers brushing across words that had once felt too indulgent, too far away. They weren't indulgent. They were waiting. Margaret turned to a fresh page and began to write. Not plans for her children. Not revisions of a will. But places she wanted to go, flavors she wanted to taste, days she wanted to claim before the clock ran out. Each word steadied her. By the time the ink ran dry, the house no longer felt heavy with betrayal. It felt like possibility. When night finally came, she stood at the kitchen window, the garden dark beyond the glass. Robert's roses stirred in the wind, their blooms heavy, their roots deep. She whispered into the quiet, "I kept my promise, love. I protected us." The grandfather clock chimed once. Margaret closed the notebook, tucked it under her arm, and carried the last slice of pie out to the garden. She left it on the fence post for the birds, watching as the moonlight silvered its crust. For the first time in years, she felt something unclench inside her. Not triumph. Not revenge. Something quieter. Freedom. And with that freedom came the certainty that tomorrow, finally, would belong entirely to her.